Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the debt crisis facing this country and why I believe that any deal to avert the fiscal cliff must address serious entitlement reform. We should not let the discussion around taxes, which is sort of dominating the airwaves here in Washington, distract us from the fact that Washington has a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Every independent expert who examined America's long-term structural fiscal dilemma comes to the same conclusion. Entitlement programs are the drivers of our national debt over the long term. Those who argue that we can dig our way out of a $16 trillion debt, and counting, by the way, by raising taxes are ignoring reality. According to the Congressional Budget Office's most recent forecast, under the current tax rates, revenues over the next 10 years will average roughly 18% of GDP. In other words, federal revenues will return to their historical average without raising taxes on anyone. I'll repeat that, Mr. President, because I think it's an important point. Our tax revenues will go back up to average 18% over the next decade, which is the historical average. That happens with existing tax policy in place without raising taxes on anyone. In fact, according to the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, under the current tax rates, revenue as a percentage of GDP will reach 18.6% by the year 2022, a decade from now. That's more than a half a percentage point higher than the historical average. Clearly, our budget problems are not because we have too little revenue. Our budget situation today relates directly to Washington's addiction to overspending. In fiscal year 2007, before the recession, total federal revenue was roughly $2.5 trillion, and total federal spending was approximately $2.7 trillion. For fiscal year 2012, 5 years later, which recently ended, total federal revenue was $2.45 trillion, basically back to the pre-recession levels, about the same level we had in revenue back in 2007. But total federal spending was above $3.5 trillion. In other words, tax revenue is back to where it was before the recession, but federal spending is now $800 billion higher than it was just 5 years ago in 2007. Even the Washington Post, which isn't considered not something I typically agree with, their editorial page agrees that the real issue is spending. In an editorial recently entitled, "Mr. Obama's Time to Lead on Entitlements," the Post argued, and I quote, "Since 60% of the federal budget goes to entitlement programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, there's no way to achieve balance without slowing the rate of increase in those programs," end quote. And speaking of entitlement programs, the Post editorial went on to say, and again I quote, "At some point he," referring to the President, "has to prepare the American people and his own supporters most of all for the hard decisions required to put the country on a sound financial footing." Even the Washington Post agrees that we must take on the driver of federal spending, entitlement spending, and secondly, that the President has got to lead on that issue. Unfortunately, the President has continued campaigning around the country for higher taxes, but until he gets serious about leading on the issue of entitlement reforms, we simply will not be able to reach an agreement to tackle our fiscal problems in a meaningful way. A look at the President's proposed tax hike demonstrates why we simply cannot tax our way out of the debt crisis. The President is proposing $68 billion in revenue next year by raising the top tax rates, in the process raising taxes on nearly 1 million small business owners. The White House claims that this will not have a major negative effect on America's business owners or their employees. But according to the National Federation of Independent Business, small businesses created 2/3 of the new jobs in the last decade, and those small businesses are the most likely to be hit by the new tax increases, and those are the small businesses that employ, by the way, Mr. President, 25% of the total workforce. According to a study by Ernst & Young, the President's proposed tax increases will result in 700,000 fewer jobs, nearly 2% decline in wages, and economic growth that is 1.3% lower than it otherwise would be. Yet despite the broad impact of these taxes on small businesses in our economy, this tax hike would only fund government operations next year for about a week. The $68 billion that the president's, if he got everything he wanted in the form of higher rates on income, higher rates on capital gains and dividends, all those things go back to the higher rates, it funds the government for about a week. The president appears to have an obsession, Mr. President, with raising income tax rates, claiming that is the only way to get significant new revenues. But this isn't true according to the administration's own budget. According to this administration's budget, the president's marginal income tax rate hike on high earners and small businesses will raise $442 billion over 10 years. That's, as I mentioned, if you look at just the top two rates that you would raise, about $442 billion over 10, which if you average that out ends up being about $40 billion a year. Yet, according to the same budget, the president's proposal to limit the value of tax expenditures for higher income earners by itself raises $584 billion over 10 years. In fact, the marginal income tax rate increases by themselves are only about 1/4 of the total $1.6 trillion in new taxes the president has proposed. So it is simply not true as a factual matter, as a matter of arithmetic, that you need to raise marginal income tax rates to raise significant revenue. Yet the president continues to insist that marginal income tax rate increases be part of any fiscal cliff agreement. You have to wonder, is it because of the arithmetic, or is it because of a liberal ideology that considers higher income tax rates to be the holy grail of tax policy? The last thing we ought to be doing if we want to boost economic growth is to raise tax rates, especially marginal income tax rates. Marginal income tax rates matter because they have incentive effects. They affect a worker's decisions to work an additional hour. The Congressional Budget Office actually explains this phenomenon in this way, and I quote, "Increasing revenues by raising marginal tax rates on labor would reduce people's incentive to work and therefore reduce the amount of labor supplied to the economy," end quote. Most Americans, Mr. President, understand this logic intuitively. If you want less of something, raise the cost of producing it by taxing it more heavily. If we raise marginal income tax rates, we will get less income as well as the labor that gives rise to that income. If we raise taxes on investment, we're likely to get less investment. It's time to recognize that we don't live in a static world. Taxpayers will adjust to higher rates, and in fact, this has already started to happen. Consider just in the last month, we've seen a host of companies announcing special dividends or rushing to move up their dividend payments before the end of the year. 228 companies announced special dividend payouts just in the month of November. That compares to 54 companies in the month of October and 72 companies in November of last year. So you've got 3 times as many companies announcing that they're going to do special dividend payouts in the month of November as you had last year. You have to believe, Mr. President, that this is a direct result of the administration's plan to raise the top dividend tax rate from 15% today to 43.4% next year. The top tax rate on dividends next year will nearly triple unless we take action to prevent that. Rather than raising taxes on America's small businesses, we should reform our tax code in a way that encourages economic growth and therefore generates new revenue. Rather than the president's approach of simply redistributing revenue, we should be focused on growing the economy over the long run, thus increasing opportunities for wealth creation for all Americans. We know this approach can work because we've done it before. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 lowered rates, broadened the tax base, and resulted in one of the longest economic booms in American history. Harvard economist Dale Jorgensen recently estimated that the gains available from fundamental tax reform amount to as much as $7 trillion in current dollar terms. The Joint Tax Committee has projected that revenue-neutral tax reform that lowered rates and broadened the tax base could lead to an increase in GDP by as much as 3.5% in the long run. Martin Feldstein, the former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, has calculated that lowering individual tax rates by only 10%, coupled with base broadening measures to ensure revenue neutrality, would raise over $500 billion in new revenue related to growth over the next 10 years. That's lowering rates by just 10%, individual tax rates. Increasing the rate of economic growth is the single most important thing that we can do to ensure greater prosperity for Americans today, but also for the coming generations. A recent report by Third Way, a center-left think tank, highlighted the importance of raising economic growth back to the post-World War II average of 3.3%. According to this report, increasing economic growth back to 3.3% starting in the year 2018 would result in nearly 2 million additional jobs by the year 2022 and roughly 5.3 million new jobs by the year 2030. It will result in more than $600 billion in new revenue by 2022 and more than $5 trillion in additional federal revenue by the year 2030. Christina Romer, former chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, has equated a 1 percentage point change in GDP with 1 million jobs a year. Given these estimates, there should be a bipartisan consensus that what we need is higher economic growth, not higher taxes. And I would propose that the fiscal cliff is both a challenge, Mr. President, and it's an opportunity. It's a challenge to get the federal government's runaway spending under control, but is also an opportunity for us to make real entitlement reforms and to put in place a structure for comprehensive tax reform next year that will have enormous benefits for our economy. I hope, Mr. President, that our President, the President of the United States, will soon join the discussion that many of us have been having about comprehensive tax and entitlement reforms. Presidential leadership on both of these critical issues is long, long overdue, and it is essential, Mr. President. You cannot do big things in this country. You can't do entitlement reform, you can't do tax reform absent presidential leadership. President Obama has a unique opportunity in his second term to do some things that are desperately needed for this country and to put our country on a path toward fiscal solvency, a trajectory that will ensure a brighter and better and more prosperous future for future generations of Americans. But in order for that to happen, we have to have the right policies in place. And those are policies that encourage jobs and economic growth. He said in his post-election press conference that his #1 priority was going to be jobs in the economy. And I couldn't agree more with that statement. But the way that you achieve that, Mr. President, is by getting fiscal discipline in place, by budgetary restraint, and by having policies in place that promote robust economic growth. You look at what solves these problems, it's the best thing that we can do is to grow our economy, and then a lot of these debt and deficit issues become much smaller by comparison. It really does come down to growth, but you simply cannot grow the economy by raising taxes on the small businesses, the job creators, the people out there who are creating the jobs, and impact the literally millions of middle-class families who are employed by those very small businesses. Millions and millions of Americans, Mr. President, work for small businesses in this country who, if the President has his way, would see their taxes go up. That is not something we want to see happen in a weak economy. In fact, it was only 2 years ago in 2010 when the President said we ought to extend all the tax rates because we shouldn't be raising taxes in the middle of a weak economy. Well, at that time, economic growth on an annualized basis was 2.4%. Economic growth now on an annualized basis is 2%. We have a weaker economy today than we did in 2010 when the President said that raising taxes in the middle of a weak economy would be a mistake and a bad idea. Well, I agreed with him then, Mr. President. I hope that he will come to the conclusion now that this is a bad solution. I know he is insistent on higher tax rates, but as I pointed out earlier, if you raise the top 2 marginal income tax rates alone, you generate about $40 billion a year in revenue next year. If you add to that capital gain and dividend tax rate increases, you get about $68 billion in additional tax revenue next year, which funds the government for just under a week. It simply does not solve the problem to raise taxes if you're talking about fixing the deficit. And on the other hand, what it does do, Mr. President, is it makes it more expensive and more difficult for American businesses to create jobs, to get Americans back to work, to get our economy growing again. and to make this country prosperous for future generations. Mr. President, I yield the floor.